Hello everyone, good afternoon. So it's a great pleasure for me to chair this session, a special GLO session on behavioral labor economics. This session is devoted to the presentation of a few chapters from the Handbook of Labor, Human Resources and Population Economics, edited by Klaus Zimmermann. And precisely these presentations today are related to the behavioral labor economics section of this handbook that I had the pleasure to edit. The handbook is really an impressive project, and it tries to provide an integrated picture of knowledge about the economic and social behaviors and social interactions on markets, in households, in companies and in various societies. And in this handbook, the behavioral labor economic section provides a comprehensive state of the art on how behavioral economics and experimental methods have contributed to the understanding of labor-related issues. And the section focuses on the individual and collective underpinning of decision-making, of mechanism design in labor markets and in organization and households. I can share my screen to show you the content, the table of content. I hope you can see that. Can I move this a bit? Yeah. So you see the content is very large. So in this section, we have a chapter on behavioral job search. We have 7 chapters related to competitive organizations and cooperative mode of organization. We have 4 chapters related to feedback, to evaluation. We have 4 other chapters related to wage policies, to bonus policies, career concerns and negotiation. And we have lastly 4 other chapters that are relative to non-cognitive skills and preferences and preferences for entrepreneurship as well. And so when I look at this list of contributors, I find this list extremely impressive because we really have the best experts in the world on the topics covered in the handbook. And I'm very grateful to all of them for the contribution. So some of them today have been able to join us to present their work. And so 6 presentations. And I'm very happy to give the floor immediately to Peter Werner. So welcome, Peter. Each of you will have about 15 minutes for presenting your chapter, and then we'll have questions from the audience. You can put your comments and remarks in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will give you the floor. So Peter, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, yeah, good afternoon from my side. Thank you very much for the possibility to present in this session. I will just share my screen. So can you see my screen? So, I would like to present the chapter on behavioral aspects of communication in organizations. And this chapter is joint work with my colleagues Fortuna Casoria and Arno Riedel. So communication in organizations is an important element of the interaction between the employer and employees, and it can crucially influence the success of the firm. And indeed, there are an increasing number of experimental studies that focus on communication in settings that can be applicable or that are applicable to interactions in organizations. And our experimental approach is well suited for this purpose for several reasons. For one, the effects of communications are very difficult to study with observational field data. So it's very difficult to track communication flows between employees and observational field data. Also, using surveys to measure communication patterns may have shortcomings. Due to an absence of monetary incentives, responses may be noisy, or employees might provide socially desirable answers. For instance, when they have to talk about the communication with their supervisors. And to some extent, experiments circumvent such problems because they provide explicit incentives, and also makes the researchers or enable the researchers to control communication flows as well as the content of communication. And in this chapter, we provide a selective review of experimental studies that focus on communication, that are relevant processes in organizations and therefore have an explicit application for interactions in firms. And we should also highlight that we focus on ex-ante communication here. For instance, ex-post communication such as feedback is not part of our chapter. Looking at the literature, we came up with 3 areas altogether in which studies have been conducted. The first area is coordination and competition. The second area is related to information asymmetries between employer and employees. And finally, we have a section on incentives. And in the following, I would like to present you a little more details, each section, what the research is all about, and what the paradigms are used in these areas. First, let's start with coordination and competition. So the achievement of organizational goals may require managers and employees to coordinate the actions in a particular way. And a classic example, for instance, are production processes where the input on one step of the production process is also dependent on inputs on earlier steps in the production process. And such problems often have a weakest link structure in the sense that the group outcome is determined by the lowest level of any member's input. And many experimental studies use the so-called weakest link or minimum effort game to study this type of problems. And these games have multiple Nash equilibrium pure strategies. In particular, the highest Pareto ranked equilibrium is payoff dominant, but it also entails risks because those players who actually choose high effort that are harmed, they are harmed when other participants, other agents in this experiment choose lower efforts. So an equilibrium with the lowest effort is a safe equilibrium choice, but also inefficient. Because in this equilibrium, potential efficiency gains through coordinations are not realized. And then the question is whether communication can increase the efficiency that is achieved in this type of games. Now, it is also important to look at the specific environment where this coordination has to take place. Often the incentives for employees are aligned and coordination increases surplus for the entire organization. However, sometimes coordination within one group leads to negative externalities of other groups. For example, when groups compete with each other, and then it's unclear what the effect of the communication on overall efficiency will be. Now, let me here give you a brief summary of the results. So what is found in this literature is that cost prepaid communication can be effective at resolving coordination failure when the incentives are aligned. So when agents can communicate, then they are able to overcome coordination problems to some extent and achieve higher efficiency. And this positive effect is found irrespective of whether communication is exogenously induced or endogenously chosen by the players. However, what is also important to keep in mind here is that some studies show that the willingness to communicate depends on the associated costs. And if communication is costly, some agents do not choose to communicate. And this, of course, has a detrimental impact on the efficiency that can be achieved then. Moreover, communication in the presence of negative externalities may have detrimental effect. For instance, it may be associated with too aggressive competition or also with collusive practices between groups. Now, let me discuss the studies on information asymmetries. So an important feature of many labor relationships is that the information between employer and employee is distributed in an asymmetric way. So one party has more information than the other party, which can cause problems. And most experimental studies so far in this area focus on cases where the employee has information advantage. And you can group these type of problems into, let's say, two broad areas. The first is the area of hidden action or moral hazard problems that emerge when the employer is not able to observe the employee's actions. And for instance, if the employer cannot monitor the employee, then the employee might have incentives to act in a way that is not optimal for the principal, for instance, by providing too low effort. The second class of problems in this area is related to hidden information or adverse selection problems. And these occur when the employee's ability and productivity are not verifiable for the employer. A classical example, for instance, is that the employer cannot observe the ability of the employee, and then the employee might have incentives to claim that he or she is of high ability when, in fact, the true ability is low. Now, studies in this area focus predominantly on hidden action problems, and these hidden action problems are experimentally investigated in trust games or in gift exchange games. And gift exchange game consists of two decisions. The first decision is that the employer decides on a wage for the employees. So this wage is paid non-contingent on performance. And then in the next step, the employee chooses effort. And in this kind of game, effort is costly for the worker, but it generates revenues for the employer. And the standard prediction is that since effort is costly, the incentive of the agent is to provide the minimum effort. And anticipating this, the employer will choose the minimum wage that is possible to be paid to the employee. However, a typical result in this literature is that higher than minimum wages and higher than minimum effort levels are achieved. And we find a positive relationship between the effort, the wage that is paid and the effort that is chosen by the employee, which is then efficiency enhancing. And this is the gift exchange effect that is observed in this literature. Now, studies in this area show that communication can help to mitigate problems arising from information asymmetries. So several studies find that communication mitigates moral hazard and is associated with more gift exchange. Although the findings are not conclusive, it seems that free-form communication might be more effective at reducing moral hazard than restricted communication. And there are only a few studies focusing on hidden information problems. And here the effect of communication seems to be context dependent. For instance, if you have bilateral interaction between employer and employee, then communication might have a positive impact. Now we come to the studies in the field of incentives. So some of these experimental studies focus on the role of communication for the effects of monetary incentive schemes that employees are exposed to. So the idea in this literature is that such monetary incentive scheme link payment in some way to the output of the employee. And then the question is, how does communication interact with different incentive schemes? Moreover, some of these incentive schemes, they always have the goal to increase performance, increase effort, but sometimes they have also unwanted effects. And then the question is whether communication can mitigate such adverse effects for the organization. And finally, an important question is what the role of communication for public good settings is, which can be seen as models for teamwork. Now, the small numbers so far that look at the interaction between incentive schemes and communication indicate that communication can be effective at increasing performance. However, we see mixed evidence for the link to counterproductive behavior. So it seems that communication may decrease sabotage internment, for instance. We also see that in dynamic settings, communication can facilitate the emergence of a ratchet effect. This means that employees strategically withhold effort in one particular period if, let's say, high effort would lead to higher demands in future periods. So communication can also have a negative effect here. In public good settings, however, there's generally a positive effect of communication. However, sometimes we see a relevant role of specific environments, for example, concerning positive spillover effects of communication or concerning the effectiveness of advice in public good settings. This brings me to my conclusion. So the majority of the experiments suggest that communication may foster both coordination and cooperation within organizations. So that is in generally a positive result. However, when some studies suggest that when coordination, for instance, leads to negative externalities, communication might also have a detrimental impact. In general, we see that there are still many unexplored areas for experimental research. And so far, the role of communication has been addressed in a relatively small number of organizational contexts and topics, and therefore there's a large potential to broaden the thematic scope of studies in this area. For instance, one possible topic where further research on communication might be needed is in the context of remuneration schemes. So can communication foster, for instance, the acceptance of certain wage levels? Another for further research is about the impact of specific communication channels and content. So we have little systematic evidence how certain communication channels and certain content affects behavior in these settings. And finally, there's room for more research concerning the role of our personal communication. So in experiments, the communication is always, or most of the times, relatively structured and anonymous. And then the question is, for instance, how patterns would change if we allow for face-to-face communication. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. So you have a big round of virtual applause. Thank you very much. So I don't know whether someone is willing to ask questions. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. I have one question perhaps to start with. Did you look at the impact of remote work on communication or on the quality of communication in teamwork? Because of course we are more and more working at distance. And so our modes of communications have evolved a lot. So do you think that there are interesting things to explore, or that there already exist some interesting papers looking at the impact of this change in organization modes on communication and its effectiveness?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question. So far, I'm not aware of studies that look at the effect of, let's say, remote work. But I think it's let's say, very important and relevant to look at this type of communication, because, of course, let's say, if we communicate remotely, then this increases the social distance between employer and employee even more, and this could well have an effect on the way how we interact with each other at the workplace. But I'm not aware of a specific study that looks at this question.
Are there other questions? No questions for the moment. Okay, so thank you very much, Peter. And I invite everyone to read your chapter because it's really very rich and interesting. So thanks a lot. Okay, so let me give the floor now to Jeff Carpenter or Peter Matthews. I don't know whether...
It's me.
You are here. Hi, Peter.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So the floor is yours for 15 minutes. And I think you should be able to share your screen.
It's not telling me I can.
Yeah. So you're going to talk about tournaments and competition, and this is joint work with Jeff Carpenter.
Yes.
To tell you everything, this is the last chapter of the handbook. And once this chapter is definitely accepted, the whole section will be completed. And so I remind you also that all the chapters that have been already validated are available online. So you can read all the chapters from the section.
All right, let me try now. There we go.
Yeah.
Better? You can...
yeah, it's perfect. Thank you. With
Okay.
the next picture.
Well, this is just about, if not quite, from my window. So this is writing from Vermont. And I should say, you know, when Jeff and I were talking about doing this a week ago, we still hadn't decided who was going to do it. We were just talking about doing slides. And then miraculously, Jeff said, oh, I just managed to schedule an eye appointment for Friday morning, and it was an open slot, and my eyes will be dilated, and it would be much better if you did it. So here I am. So let me talk a little bit about the paper, such as it is. So let's start with the big question, which is, do we actually need another review of tournaments? This is probably one of the most heavily reviewed areas in the literature. And it's an open question about whether or not we need one. And our argument is yes, but one of the things that the knowledge that there were other surveys out there gave us is it allowed us to be a little bit idiosyncratic. And here's what I mean by this. This is a literature in which there are probably 200 or 300 papers one could have surveyed. And if you look at our bibliography, you'll see somewhere between 100 or 200 of them. That means inevitably that we made some choices, and there are probably people in this seminar who have written on tournaments whose paper is not there and who are probably instantly aggravated. So let me tell you what our motivation was. The survey reflects, in a sense, our own engagement with the literature, the work that we've done, the papers that we found kind of stimulating, and more importantly, perhaps our sense of what the most promising research avenues are. For that reason, the paper has a very particular organization, by which I mean, I'm having enormous trouble with the slides today. There we go. So rather than do a kind of an exhaustive survey of the literature, basically what we do is we provide a relatively short theoretical section and a review of the experimental tests of the kind of basic model. And then we focus on what we think of as the kind of thematic extensions for this paper. And here's what we have in mind. It's a kind of almost canonical result now that experimentalists and others have found that tournaments not only generate more effort, they generate typically excess effort or effort above and beyond what any theoretical model would predict. And while much of the literature has focused on the immediate or first order consequences of that, the thing that has fascinated Jeff and I over the last decade or two is that one can imagine that this kind of excess competition and generated in tournament-like environments is going to have both positive and negative externalities or consequences. That is to say, if tournaments engender competition, competition has these side effects, and these side effects are often unintended when we first think about tournament-like structures, and we can think of them as both being positive and negative. And one of the things we do in the paper is we gather all of the papers that we think of as really classic examples of both the positive and negative side effects or externalities of tournament-like environments. And so it has a different focus and a different flavor, I think, than most papers that have sort of looked at this. All right, so what are we going to do in the presentation today? I'll share an example or two of each, which are drawn from our own work. I'll talk a little bit about other papers that are kind of inspirational, maybe a little bit about future directions. And you're going to almost certainly, Marie-Claire, have to stop me because I'll probably run over. So maybe I'll do the first. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the power of tournaments. Can we harness all this glorious excess competition for good? So I'm going to talk in this case initially about a paper that Jeff and I wrote with a student once upon a time, Ben Tabb, who's now working at an investment bank in New York. So knows something about excess competition. But here was the thing we were thinking about. It struck us as that there was a kind of an open space, an open place for people who do experimental work, for people who work on labor, for people who work on tournaments, to make an important contribution initially to kind of public finance. If you think about the canonical model of tax incidence in public finance, apart from the kind of the reduced form stuff, it is still 100 years after some version of the model was first formulated, a model in which people are faced with a fixed wage and are making choices about the numbers of hours worked. It's a fascinating story, except that less than 10% of all workers in the United States work under such a model. So in a way, you couldn't come up with a less interesting model of the tax burden of the labor consequences of progressive taxation. So the question that initially motivated Jeff and I was, we wanted to start to think about what tax burden looked like in a world in which people were compensated under the kinds of compensation schemes that we see every day. And in that context, we thought tournaments was a great place to start, right? Especially if you were interested in the so-called deadweight loss associated with taxation of high-income people. Because the further up the income scale you go, the more likely you are to find people working in tournament-like environments where compensation depends on rank or relative standing. We had this intuition, and it turns out that the intuition was borne out, and I'll show you some evidence of this, but we had this intuition that once people start to focus on rank, once people are both paid for rank and acquire some utility from rank, that the incentives at the margin of progressive taxes would be blunted. That is to say, if you're worried about finishing first, and it's being first or second that drives a big part of your compensation, then an increase in the marginal tax rate at that margin of victory or defeat is probably going to have very little effect on effort. And so we had this intuition that the deadweight losses associated with the typical tax in a kind of tournament-like environment might be very different, especially if we built out the kind of behavioral story about kind of joy of winning or excess drive or excess competitiveness that we think were going to be very important to tell the story. So I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker. So as I just said, there are really very few experiments, lab or otherwise, on taxation in tournaments with or without behavioral issues. In fact, there was very little theory. This is still one of the regrets I have is this paper doesn't seem to have had many legs. This is a really underexplored literature. There's exactly one model out there on tournaments and taxation, and that's Persson-Sandmo in the Journal of Public Economic Theory, now almost 20 years ago. We add a little bit to it in our model for a reason I'll mention in a second. But anyway, we have a 2x2 real effort design in which we vary two things: compensation. We've had people playing under piece rates in tournaments. And the tax code, we looked at flats and progressive taxes. And crucially, we did something else, which I think is really important and something we can do in the lab, which is most public finance models, right? When they talk about burden of taxation, they talk about government effectively imposing taxes. And then you never find out what happens to the revenues. So revenues are dumped at sea. And that may be a particular version of how government works, but it's not our version of how government works. And so one of the things we do in this model is we allow tax revenues to fund a public good. We could imagine a government redistributing those revenues, and that would be a different story. But it's important, we think, and something that we can do as experimentalists effectively, is to create a model in which tax revenues, for example, are used. They're not dumped out to sea. I mean, that's probably a good thing to say. So let me tell you super quickly what the results, and I can move on. So first of all, take a look at the column. Let's say the column looking at piece rate. So if we switch from a less progressive to a more progressive code, in other words, from basically in our model, a flat tax to a progressive tax code that's pivoted at the original kind of equilibrium effort levels, we see, as you would expect, that the tax has a disincentive to work, right? Effort goes down here from 45 to 42. It's a significant effect at the 10% level. And it's exactly the result we expect, right? This is a kind of the sanity check, the internal validity check. If you look across the first row, you also see, consistent with a huge literature in the tournament on tournaments and competition, that there's a big increase in effort when we move from piece rate compensation to tournament-based compensation, right? And that's also significant at any reasonable level. What's fascinating to us, and this is the key here, is if you're looking now at the second column, there's absolutely no difference between effort in the tournament-based scheme under a flat or progressive tax code. That is to say, the responsive workers in this particular world is to work as hard as they did before, despite the progressive tax, and despite the fact that we're going to actually, I mean, one of the interesting properties of this result is we collect more in tax revenues. In our little model, that funds more public goods. And in the particular implementation we're looking at, the switch to the progressive tax and a quite steep tax code actually increases welfare conventionally measured. Because effectively what you have are very competitive workers at the top end of the income distribution, working very, very hard, not responding to taxes and funding large amounts of public good provision. And so this is, I think, is a nice example for us of both of the power of experimental methods, the power of tournaments, well harnessed to produce positive results. And I want to add one more thing about this picture, which is, and you can't quite see it here, but I'll mention it quickly, which is this effect is not just about the competitive effects of tournaments per se, but works particularly well for workers who are competitive in the first place. We independently measure worker competitiveness, and we see that these big increases that we're talking about, the effects of tax, are largely driven by the presence of competitive workers. In a world where there are competitive workers, in a world in which workers care a lot about rank, the burden of tax revenue looks really different, right? This is a story that a conventional public finance person could not tell. It's a story that we can tell as experimentalists. It's a story that we can build some theory around. And it's a story that I think should be worked on, kind of continue, because there hasn't really been much follow-up here. But this idea of using experimental methods to explore the intersection between either tournaments or other kinds of compensation schemes and taxation is, I think, an underexplored literature. How am I doing for time?
You still have 10 minutes?
10 minutes? Oh, I'm going to be, oh.
No,
that seems possible.
I'm exaggerating. 8 minutes.
8 minutes. All right.
Max.
Max 8 minutes. All right. So let me give you some more examples of the power of tournaments. Actually, I want to build on something that the literature that Peter was talking about in the previous presentation, which is this literature on hidden action and hidden effort. One of the really, really nice, so here's some very nice experiments that recognize that in a tournament setting, once people have this desire to win, once people's competitive juices are flowing, they will do many things to win a tournament, including reveal things like otherwise unobservable ability. And so in a way, there's a nice connection here between the adverse selection story and or moral hazard story that Peter was alluding to in the previous presentation and the kind of tournament story, right? So it's an old idea of Bengt Holmström, but Dickmans et al. And so et al. Have these really nice papers in which they show that one of the things that tournaments can do, especially tournaments populated by competitive agents, is that they can solve other problems. And the other problems include thinking about moral hazard and adverse selection problems, right? Workers who want to win will reveal all sorts of things in the process. And a smart firm will condition their posteriors about ability on behavior in a tournament. The So et al. Paper does something sort of similar. It shows that tournaments are also, when they're working well, going to encourage learning, right? If it matters a great deal to you that you win the tournament for both either financial reasons or monetary reasons, but also psychological reasons, you're likely to be more receptive to new techniques and new technologies that allow you to win. I'm probably not going to have a chance to talk about the dark side of all of this, but as you may or may not know, Jeff and I have done a lot of work on sabotage, which is the dark side of this story about the impulse to win. But that's a nice example of let me mention another two, and maybe I'm going to wrap it up just because I want to. And I want to give credit to some very interesting papers that maybe don't get as much credit as they should. Gilpatrick et al. is a really nice paper published in GLO. And I want to say, by the way, I don't know if this is true for other people presenting, but one of the unsung heroes of the development of this kind of behavioral labor stuff has to be GLO. Right? I mean, a surprising number of the papers here are GLO papers, and that's worth saying right now. Gilpatrick et al. Is a nice example, and it's a really interesting example. It turns to almost, you can imagine turning the labor market story on its head. Suppose that one of the things you're trying to do is regulate employers. You could imagine using tournament-like structures to encourage employers to compete, to not be monitored as aggressively, to not be audited as frequently. Right? And so Gilpatrick et al. Turned the tournament logic, the competitive logic on its head, and use it to design or to think about regulatory mechanisms that economize on regulatory resources and encourage competition between the objects of regulation, either the firms or workers, whoever, to in effect compete not to be regulated. Right? You can imagine in a tournament in which the prize is a lower frequency of audits. If all you need is information on relative performance, which is the advantage of the tournament, that's much easier to do. And you can imagine regulators being able to more effectively and more economically reach specific targets in terms of regulatory objectives. It's a very, very clever idea. And I want to kind of give a shout out. I'll mention one other like this. This is, I'm going to get his name wrong, but Seda et al. Have a very nice paper too. This is in Restat a couple of years ago, and in fact was very inspirational for work that Jeff and I and Julian Jameson did on choice architecture in another case. So they use tournaments to inform choice architecture problems, right? The idea here is that when confronted with a lot of choices, consumers can sometimes be benefited by, in effect, having those choices organized into a tournament-like structure. That is to say, rather than think about facing 16 choices in a particular difficult decision, think about 4 and pick a winner. Think about another 4, pick a winner, then have the winners play off against one another, then have those winners play off against one another. Here's what's interesting about that result. Consumers seem not to like it, but it's incredibly effective. It produces, quote unquote, the preferred outcome much more often than alternatives. So this idea of harnessing competition, harnessing tournament incentives, taking advantage of what we know from all of the previous experimental work on intensity of competition and in a sense, putting them to good work, right? Harnessing their powers for good has got to be, I think, a really, really important next generation of research within the kind of behavioral experimental community. I think it's a really important idea. I'm not going to talk at all, I think, about the bad side. Actually, I'll mention 2 more good ones. Harness competitive ends. This is also Jeff and I have done with a whole host of co-authors, Jess Holm, Damien Damino, Joshua Foster. Tournament-like incentives can be used to encourage philanthropic behavior, right? Duffy and Kornienko have a great paper on giving tournaments, which effectively say, look, if one of the things you want to do is generate charitable donations or philanthropic activity, and we know how competitive people can be in tournament-like environments, as much as possible, organize those philanthropic activities using a tournament-like framework. So the giving tournament, giving tournament is an utterly trivial, in some sense, design in which, you can imagine simple dictator games in which the only difference is we let you know how you rank relative to others. It shouldn't matter, but it does so much. In much the same way that the work we've done on auctions suggests that anytime you can get people, in a sense, competing one another in a tournament-like structure, in the classic example of which is this bucket auction that we've worked on for 5 or 10 years, donations look much higher. And so the idea here broadly, just to kind of say this over and over again, is we know from a big literature that Jeff and I mostly touch on in this paper that tournaments not only generate competitive behavior, they generate typically more competition, more competitive behavior than a simple, straightforward model would believe. You need a behavioral model to explain the degree of competition. The next step in thinking about behavioral public policy and behavioral finance here is to say, okay, great, what do we do with all this competition? What do we do with all this competitive impulse? Because the second half of the paper, I'm not going to have time to talk about here, talks about the bad side, right? There is a bad side. Competition can be bad psychologically. Competition can induce all sorts of antisocial behaviors. Competition of that kind can reduce social preferences. There's a nice growing literature on this question. So the challenge for us, I think, is to think about ways in which we can build behavioral models of competitiveness into public policy in a way that recognizes both the power of competition but also the potential for harm. And I think I'm going to stop there rather than show all of the other slides. Yeah, perils of tournaments. Yeah, I mean, cheating, sabotage. I mean, there's a long story here. Some wonderful papers. The last of these, by the way, is probably the least developed literature. There's a nice Buser Andreeva paper on cooperativeness in Chen et al., which is not even economics on the effects on inequality. The story here is, and this is an important part of the story, which is participation in tournament-like environments in which competition is heightened often spills over beyond the experiment, beyond the tournament, into other parts of life. And so, for example, the social preference story is a story that says even after people participate in tournaments, social preferences there's hysteresis in social preferences that's driven in part by this participation. And so if we're going to think about harnessing competition, we have to think about these possible downsides. All right. I'm sorry I probably took too long, Claire, but...
No, you're on time. That's perfect.
Oh, thank you
very much, Peter. Thanks a lot. So again, we congratulate you virtually. Thank you. So if you have any question, please ask your question. I have one question to start. So you mentioned the role of tournaments to help people update about their ability, their skill, and so it's to some extent encouraging them. It's motivating, but on the other hand, we also know that in some cases it may be totally discouraging. And so, of course, it raises a number of questions about how can we design tournaments so that everyone can benefit and to minimize the number of losers. I mean, should we design systems in which you would have different levels of competition by skill level, for example? Or how can we maximize the positive effect of competition without killing people, right?
Yes, the object in economics is not to kill the people as much as possible. Yeah, absolutely. No, so Claire, you raise a really, really important point, and it's actually another place where I think there are opportunities, especially for those of us who have, you know, I'll call them behavioral impulses to make important contributions. Here's what I mean by this, right? There is a literature within tournaments that we review in our kind of review of the sort of traditional literature that says, yeah, designers often have a benefit when they're faced with participants who have heterogeneous abilities to organize sub-tournaments, right? This idea that somehow you have to create some impression on the part of some people that they have some chance of winning something. And that's right, and there's a robust literature there. But what's really interesting to me, and again, this is a place for anyone who is younger and more ambitious and more harder working than I am to kind of make a big contribution, which is none of that literature has a behavioral quality to it, right? And so there's a real place to think about design here that is informed by some of what we know about the behavioral principles. So most of the time, this literature is simply about effort inducing the inducement of effort, recognizing that people who are, for example, underdogs are just going to expend less effort anyway. It's typically not about morale, it's not about psychology, it's not about, but you could think about design at the level of the firm that would do exactly that, that would organize workers at a firm into sub-tournaments, recognizing the behavioral consequences and psychological consequences of participation in tournaments, and recognizing the implications of those psychological consequences for firm profitability. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a huge open area of research. Please, everyone, go do this. And I will say one thing before which is I have a whole morning of thesis students too, and so I'm going to have to leave off in about 15 or 20 minutes. But I've loved what I've heard so far, and thank you for organizing that.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
I have one question, but it's really a question for everybody and also Peter.
Okay.
Well, thank you for the presentation. It's really, it's really nice. And we're doing an educational intervention that has some competitive elements, so this is very, close, to my agenda. Marie-Claire, on your question, I mean, the issue is if you design these sub-tournaments, what effects will it have on the efficiency of entry into tournaments in the future? I mean, if you put me in a competition with other low-skilled people, then I can believe that, I have the chance to win something, but then I enter into another competition in the real world, and then that's not going to be true. So, I mean, it has many different aspects, so I don't know the answer, but I think it's an amazing, very fascinating question.
Well, I think that there may be a gradation and a dynamic so that you start perhaps at a little level, but progressively you can move upward. And well, indeed, it's a big question. And
can I ask, Marie-Claire, are the chapters already available somewhere?
All the chapters are available except yours, because you still have to submit some minor adjustment, I think. But once it's done, I mean,
I'll have to talk to Joe.
Production, and it will be so. All the other chapters.
Okay. So,
except one who is in production, but all the others are publicly available on the website.
So I say that because we do talk a little bit about experiments and tournaments that within education that you might find useful. So there are.
Yeah, that'll be great. Yeah, I'll look forward to reading it.
Thank you. We'll try and get better about the editorial corrections. So.
Thank you very much, and thank you for waking up early for us, Peter. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we still talk about some interesting aspect of competition, comparison, etc. It's income inequality. And Ranveig is with us today. So Ranveig, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. Is this working?
Yes, yes, we can see your slide.
Yeah, let me just see what I can do as well. I just want it on a different screen, sorry. Let's see. Okay. So inequality is one of the most pressing issues in the modern world, and it impacts important life outcomes such as health, education, labor market outcomes. But what do really people consider to be fair and unfair inequalities? And the appropriate policy response to inequalities really depend on that answer. So it seems important to investigate and to understand which income inequalities do people really consider fair and unfair. So we have written this chapter. This is together with Alexander Koppelin and Bertil Tungården at the Norwegian School of Economics. And my name is Ranveig Falch. I'm a postdoctoral researcher there. And we have really dug into the experimental evidence on fair and unfair income inequality. This is sort of the overview of this chapter, where we go into the normative background, the theoretical framework. But what I'm going to focus on today is the experimental evidence. One, we're going to go through, this weight that people attach to self-interest versus fairness preferences, or what they consider fair, if there is a trade-off, if there's a conflict of interest. Because that might differ from person to person, and we really don't know. Is it, homo economicus? Probably not, but how do people differ there? And then we're going to look at the link between fairness and inequality acceptance. Sorry, my kid just arrived home. Great. And then I'm going to talk to you about the pluralism of fairness views. Because it might be that we have differences in the weight that we attach to fairness versus self-interest, but we might also disagree about what is fair and unfair income inequalities. And lastly, we're going to look at the origins of selfishness and fairness views. If there are these differences, how do they come about? In the chapter, we also look at these applications in terms of, for instance, how do these ideas about what's fair and unfair inequalities relate, for instance, to incentive and bonus schemes, which might be quite interesting to have a look at in relation to the previous chapter discussed as well. And then here, I'm going to start off by looking at what people have as an idea about this weight they attach to selfishness versus what they consider fair. And here there's quite an extensive experimental literature, mostly focusing on this classical dictator game where people they're two persons and they're receiving this money from heaven, and one of them has to decide how to distribute that money between the two of them. And here the assumption in most of these articles is that there's an agreement that the fair thing to do would be to split equal, given that they haven't really done differences, there are no differences in effort, etc. This is just manna from heaven. And then how to interpret if they don't do that is that there is this trade-off between, taking more to myself because of self-interest versus what you consider fair and putting some weight on that. And what we've seen in this literature is that there is a substantial fraction of subjects who put some weight on what they consider fair and not only focus on their self-interest. Now, there is a bit of heterogeneity here, of course. So some only focus on their self-interest, whereas some would put all the weight on what they consider fair and split equal. And there's also some heterogeneity when it comes to background characteristics, such as there's some evidence that females might tend to be less selfish here than males, but this is not true in all samples. For instance, where I come from, my school, I know they've done a study in the student populations. Seems that as females, we are as selfish as the males. What's quite interesting, though, to notice in this literature that has, at least in the early days, focused a lot on the student populations, is that in the general population, it seems that this selfishness and the weight put on that is sort of reduced in comparison to the student populations. Now, when we think about fairness and inequality acceptance, how do these two things link? It could be that we just are averse to all inequalities. But Kono 2000 introduces this idea into the experimental sphere of potentially we could be driven by the accountability principle, that could explain all this inequality aversion. That we have an idea about those inequalities that arise from sources within our individual control. Well, those are fair. We might not want to do anything about them, but those inequalities that arise from factors outside individual control, say race, gender, all these things, luck, those might be things that we would like to reduce, those inequalities that arise from that. And in his experiment and also later experiments, there seems to be support for this, that we have this differentiation when it comes to the source of inequality. That seems to be important. And we find the same thing, or articles and authors find the same thing when it comes to survey evidence and also actually neuroeconomic experiments. That it's not really that people are inequality averse, they seem to be unfairness averse. But there also seems to be slight disagreement about what is really fair. In a given setting, in identical settings, we can disagree about what is the fair thing to do. And I think we recognize that from the political debate. Even if we were to have the same beliefs about the sources of inequality, the cost of distribution, we might still disagree about whether this is a fair or an unfair inequality. And thus, what do we do about it? So Copeland et al. 2007 study, for instance, in a population, look at whether there are really different fairness views. And they find that the largest share of the participants are meritocrats. So they are more in line with this previous idea here that it really depends on the source of inequality, what I want to do about it. But there's also a significant share that are just egalitarians. They don't accept inequality, whatever the source. If it's due to differences in effort, I don't care, I want to reduce it. And then you have libertarians who, they also represent a significant share here. And they, of course, don't want to do anything about this inequality, independent on whether it was due to luck or merit. Now, the next question, could there be differences across countries, across societies when it comes to these fairness ideals? And one paper here is by Almost and et al. In 2020, where they look at general population samples in the US and in Norway, and they have a spectator design. So instead of having stakes in the setting, there's a third party, anonymous, and now there's two other people who you have been, explained that they have done some sort of work, there's an inequality. And they vary here the source of that inequality, whether it's due to merit differences or whether it's due to luck differences. And then we look at whether in these identical controlled environment, do Americans and do Norwegians have different fairness ideals, different ideas about what's acceptable inequalities here and not. And these are the results on that front. We see that in both societies, the largest share is really the meritocrats. And they're not really significantly different from each other, these shares. But where Americans and Norwegians really differ is that the share of libertarians are quite a lot larger in the US, and the share of egalitarians is quite a lot larger in Norway. Now here, this is sort of where it gets really, really interesting, I think, and where we might want to know lots more, is the origins of these fairness preferences. Because we've seen now that we differ in the weight we assign to fairness versus self-interest. And we differ in, what we consider to be fair. And what are the origins of these fairness preferences, and how do they interact with and are shaped by social institutions? So there's two sort of approaches to this. One is where you look at child development and see how these preferences develop with age through childhood and adolescence. And the other is to experimentally look at how important life events and social institutions really shape fairness preferences. So I'm going to go through those two, both in terms of first the weight assigned to fairness versus self-interest, and then second, fairness views. So development with age. Here, this is, a classic important paper. I'm so sorry for my 1-year-old. She does not know how to do it. But she will, at 3 years old, probably behave like she does now, pretty selfishly. And then, there's going to be this development through to 7, 8 years old, where we see that these kids mostly try to eliminate inequality. And in line with the general finding that children transfer more and act less selfishly with age are these results. But we see that the negative correlation between age and selfishness, it sort of stops a bit there at 8. So that's the peak where you are maybe the most egalitarian, or at least wants to reduce inequalities the most. And it doesn't seem to go on, say, till 18 years old, as they look at in Albos et al. And then there's the role of life experiences, which is really an area where there's a lot happening these days. So one of these papers is Kosse et al., who look at the effects of a mentoring program for kids and see whether the social environment change of children could affect the weight they put on self-interest versus fairness. And it just in general, their pro-sociality. And here they find that those who are assigned to this mentoring program, gets a mentor, they seem to behave more pro-socially later on. And there's also studies showing that exposure to social norms of giving and educational interventions increases sharing. But I would say that this is not always the case. So a paper here by a couple in 2020 where they look at being assigned to an early education program, really daycare, for the 3 to 4 year olds, it doesn't seem to have an effect on selfishness. But what it does seem to affect is their fairness views. So that seems to be changed. And I'm going to go over to that part now. Because this is, the origins of those fairness views, that we might just be different in what we consider fair. And if we look at the study, one of these studies who've looked at this in kids and the development in kids, is that we see that kids are, when they're really young, quite egalitarian. They just would like to split equal, whatever the source. And then they become more and more autocratic in their fairness views, and that sort of becomes the the dominant fairness ideals when they're 18. And of course, we saw that going into adulthood. And there could be two things going on here, at least. So one is they might experience different handling of inequalities that they themselves are experiencing. So 10-year-olds might have adults sort of, you know, splitting equal between them, not really taking into account, you know, one put in more effort, the other didn't, whereas 18-year-olds might be held more accountable in whatever inequalities they seem to be facing. But of course, also the meritocratic fairness ideals is, you know, cognitively more difficult as well. You actually have to think about the source of inequality. Is it within or outside of individual control? And in these lab experiments, sometimes that's easy. I think in the real world, that could be really, really hard. And then lastly here, I just want to touch upon the research that has been done in terms of the role of different experiences and how that shapes fairness ideals as well. So here we, for instance, have a few different papers and different settings where they have experimental evidence showing that these events can alter fairness views in adulthood. So you have unemployment spells affecting greater exposure to war, early education programs, you know, they seem to make kids more egalitarian, for instance, or higher academic achievements. So it seems that this is not something that's at least not malleable or cannot ever be changed. But these, of course, are important life events, I'd say. So to conclude, this chapter surveys the large and growing literature on fairness and economic behavior. And people seem to be willing to sacrifice some, at least, of their self-interest to really do what is considered fair. But they do make distinctions between what's fair and unfair inequalities. And that sort of matters for how much they want to redistribute. There also seems to be just considerable heterogeneity in both the way people attach to fairness, but also their fairness views. And it seems to be that this develops through childhood, potentially via social institutions, but that it can also be changed in adulthood. And further, this chapter illustrates the pluralism in fairness preferences, and that it's essential for understanding quite a large number of economic phenomena, such as what we go deeper into in the paper, bargaining, incentive structures in the labor market, and redistributional preferences. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranveig. We are running out of time, but if there is one question.
I had a very short question, maybe, can I?
Yeah, please go, Astrid.
I found it very interesting, your discussion of the development of the fairness preferences. I was just wondering, do you know if there is literature on the impact of siblings and, you know, how many siblings you have and or where you are in the birth order and so on these kind of preferences?
I don't know a paper at the top of my head, but I just feel like we've seen something about, you know, being a kid from a single family having less egalitarian preferences. But I think this is something you could look up in Koppeln and the Samak Koppeln Tungan paper from 2020, where I think they've looked at that at least.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'll look it up.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry to have to interrupt the discussion.
Thank you.
Very interesting. But we will move very naturally to the next talk by Seda, who is going to talk about the formation and malleability of preferences and non-cognitive skills. So I think the transition will be easy to Seda. So please, Seda, the floor is yours.
I'm sorry. You can see my screen, right?
We can see it, yeah.
Okay, I'll just make it, yeah. Okay, thank you. It's great to be here with this group and talk about the handbook chapter. Thank you for the opportunity. My handbook chapter is called The Formation and Malleability of Preferences and Non-Cognitive Skills. So yeah, it's gonna be kind of a natural transition after Ranveig's very nice talk on you know, the development of social preferences. And it's also going to allow me to skip something, so thank you. So because I have too many slides, I realized. Anyway, we all know that preferences matter. So preferences, beliefs, they come together to determine behavior in different domains, and this leads to different individual and social outcomes, like at the individual level, financial, educational, and health outcomes, and also social outcomes such as gender gaps, inequality, diversity, social mobility. So we economists have traditionally focused on risk and time preferences, and more recently, social preferences. So starting with these main three types of preferences, risk attitudes have been found to affect health behaviors, such as smoking and outcomes, of course, entrepreneurship, whether you hold stocks, time preferences, both patience and impulsivity, self-control. They affect educational outcomes, procrastination, health, addiction, obesity, financial welfare, behavioral issues of students at school, and social preferences, altruism, trust, positive and negative reciprocity. They predict charitable giving, social support, and public good provision. So, but in addition to these three main types of preferences, economists recently are looking at more like a broader range of preferences. Of course, at that point comes the natural question of what is a preference, what's the trait, what is a non-cognitive skill. So please don't ask me that at the end because I don't know. But like for example, competitive attitudes has recently been shown to be important for education, labor market outcomes, and gender gaps in these outcomes. It predicts level of education, field of study, occupation, and income conditional on occupation. And some preferences or traits that are inputs into the production function in education or in organizations are termed sometimes non-cognitive skills by the labor economists. And these are time preference, patience, and self-control. Additionally, the big five trait of conscientiousness, which is also significantly linked to grit and perseverance. And these are important to education policymakers because they also affect achievement gaps and inequality. And there are also yet other preferences that are recently being explored by myself and by others. So like leadership, willingness, preferences towards teamwork, cooperation, and on top of that, there are beliefs and skills such as self-confidence, social confidence, empathy, perspective taking, and creativity that economists are designing interventions on. Of course, these are not preferences in the strict sense of the term, but I just want to mention them as potential inputs into performance outcomes. So, I mean, the chapter and also this presentation will revolve around three main questions. The first is, what is the predictive power of measured preferences on different types of outcomes, individual and social? Second, given that preferences predict outcomes in a wide variety of domains, what factors affect the formation of these preferences? And I think these factors can be grouped as individual, family, social environment, exogenous shocks, disasters, COVID-19, culture, gender roles. And third, is it possible to improve individual and social welfare by changing preferences and non-cognitive skills through interventions? Okay, so a major issue here is methodological. How can we measure preferences best in children and adults? Because if you want to look at predictive power, you need to know that you are eliciting the kind of the correct trait. Recently, we're designing incentivized tasks, or what I mean by we as economists are designing incentivized tasks or self-reports incorporated into large and nationally representative surveys. I would like to talk about one such example by Falch et al. Presenting global evidence on economic preferences. Gathering evidence from 80,000 individuals in 76 countries, they show that survey questions are predictive of behavior in incentivized experiments predict outcomes. So these are within countries, labor market decisions, self-employment, savings, pro-social behaviors. And across countries, preferences vary with aggregate outcomes such as GDP, for example, patients and GDP, positively correlated. Risk tolerance predicts entrepreneurship, and negative reciprocity predicts armed conflict. So, I mean, you can believe me when I say that preferences have predictive power within a country and across countries. So then the next question is, let me check the time. What shapes preferences, right? So here I'm not going to try to give you a full list of results because, you know, some results are ambiguous, they are heterogeneous with respect to age, there are interactions, but maybe I can give a couple of examples under each domain. So within individual characteristics, gender, age, and IQ are important, and these have interactions as well. So for example, women are more risk averse, less competitive, but these differences may emerge with adolescence with no differences being visible when children are young. Prosociality and patience generally increases with age. There may be positive relationship between IQ and patience. So in terms of family characteristics, of course, genetics is important, but also intergenerational transmission that seems to be moderated by parenting styles and efforts. So people have looked at risk preferences, time preferences, competition within families and found positive correlations. And overall, higher SES is associated with more patience, more altruism, less risk seeking, but this is again moderated by parental investments generally. There are different aspects of culture, religion, language, matrilineal, you know, how gender equal the country is. And I mean, these may have effects on preferences, not always in the expected direction. And priming studies that prime cultural identity show that use a different way to show these associations. Peers and school environment is important. Personality traits can be passed on across peers. And for example, exposure to lower SES peers can increase prosociality. And then there's the exposure to exogenous shocks, natural disasters, violence, significant life events. So I think the takeaway from this part of the literature is that significant life events can alter preferences at least for a while, but this may be heterogeneous and interact with individual characteristics. So next comes the question of malleability. So the question here is, can individual and social outcomes be improved by changing preferences? So here there are maybe two types of interventions. First is targeted interventions that target a specific skill, I mean, or a specific preference parameter, or there are interventions that are just done by governments or some NGOs, and then they turn out to have effects on preferences. So yeah, Ranveig also talked about the Chicago Heights Early Education Program. I'll skip that. These programs particularly focus on the younger ages because then you have multiplier effects. And it may be especially important to prevent disadvantaged groups from falling behind to the extent that these programs can build non-cognitive skills that are predictive of achievement. So I usually get the question of, you're an economist, why are you doing these interventions kind of question? So I want to say that economists can use theory as a guide to develop targeted interventions to change behavior. For example, how can you induce patient behavior? I mean, our models give us insights on that, and we can build a program to use that and leverage that to target that specific parameter. And second, experimentalists provide incentivized tasks to measure what exactly changes and the mechanisms for it. I mean, usually there are studies in, you know, labor economics looking at real outcomes, for example, after the preschool program. But I think kind of the literature is moving towards using experimental tasks as end-line outcomes of these interventions so that mechanisms can also be more clearly seen. So I think that's important. How many minutes do I have? 5? Or
exactly 5 minutes.
Okay. So I'll very quickly talk about one of the interventions, let's say, that we did in Turkey. So, for example, in one program, we wanted to target time preferences. So the theoretical basis of this is if you make costly investment to imagining the future selves, you should be more patient. So we design a program that includes, let's try to induce children to be forward-looking, like imagining future selves, giving them experience, imagining what will happen in the future, building a time machine, and things like that. And then we evaluate impact through behavioral experiments. And we find that children who receive the program can resist tempting early consumption and display fewer behavioral problems at school. We also have a mindset intervention, but I'll skip that. Okay, so overall, preferences are crucial in predicting many individual and social outcomes. Some preferences can be viewed as inputs into the production function. Economists have a role in designing interventions that can change preferences, and these can also correct inefficiencies. For example, I didn't talk about this, but a growth mindset intervention that teaches children that with effort, you can improve your outcomes, both leads to an increasing grit or perseverance, but also closes gender gaps in competition in a dynamic competitive task. So these interventions can have different effects. It actually also has some impact on altruism, but I don't have time to talk about it. So I think here I think, did I put it somewhere? Yeah, it's important to study the spillovers to other traits and behaviors that the intervention didn't really target it in the first place. And so I think moving forward, there are different kind of avenues, like methodologically, I think it's important to explore relations and complementarity between psychological traits and economic preferences. There are new areas that life brings, right? I mean, COVID-19 and preferences, I think it's a very good example of how it, reflected on this research agenda. For example, people have looked at how COVID-19 has affected preferences. For example, we have a paper showing that priming people with COVID-19 reduces their willingness to work in teams. They want to work more alone. So it's important for corporations potentially. And also studying how preferences affect our responses to such crises. For example, more pro-social people may wear masks more, right? Things like that. And then on the question of malleability, again, as I said, it's important to look for the long-run effects and spillovers of these interventions. And a very good question is, at what age is it best to intervene? And again, this ties into the age trajectory of preference formation, because if you know the age trajectory, then you would know when to intervene and on what preferences. And I think also there is also a good avenue for neuroeconomics, because neuroeconomists are studying, the neural underpinnings of our behavior, and for example, development of empathy as a precursor to pro-social behavior. And I think neuroeconomics can help us understand and better put forward the mechanisms of these interventions. Thank you so much for listening. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Seda.
Thank you
for the great talk. We have, again, only 1 or 2 minutes for questions.
Sorry.
It's a pity not to have more, but if someone wants to ask questions. So Seda, what do you think is, because we see for children, it's possible to change. So is it still true for adolescents? Is it still true for adults? I mean, or is it too late? So feeling, and is it better to target individuals, or is it better to target groups to increase efficiency of these interventions? What's your feeling about that?
Those are very good questions. I mean, in the context of time preference, I think there's one study by Marta Serra Garcia and others on time preference, like a financial literacy intervention. I think that's with adolescents, and they show some effects on self-control. So there are some papers showing that interventions with adolescents can work also. Also, we don't know if you change something in childhood, how long run that effect is going to be. So I think the only way to answer those questions is to do the intervention, but that's also quite costly, and cost also comes in. I mean, I think when you intervene in groups like these classroom environments, that may have effects different than if you took each individual and said, this is important, this is important. So I think the classroom culture and the way it is also contributes to how much, the intervention will stick. So, but these are very important questions, and I think it would be great to design a study that can, look at these effects maybe by varying them as treatments. So those are very, very interesting open questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the moment?
I have one question.
Yeah, please, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Seda, for your presentation. Quickly, have you used the nudge in your intervention at all?
Nudge, you mean like the Richard Taylor kind of, intervention? I mean, we didn't really use.
Correct.
No, not really. I mean, no, but yeah, I can see how it may be used in some cases, but these interventions were more educational programs that went on for a while, and rather use like the teacher giving case studies, activities, and things like that. So we didn't really use nudges in these.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I suggest that you unshare your screen, Seda.
Oh, okay.
And we'll keep talking about preferences, but specifically the preferences of women. So I will give the floor now to Lina Lozano.
So, okay, I guess you should be able to see my screen now and sharing.
Perfect. Yeah, it's perfect, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot for putting this nice session together. I guess it's also very nice exploring indeed. We will continue with the discussion on preferences and more specifically applied for a gender context. So yeah, it was great to share this chapter with Eva Ranveig and Ernesto Ruben, which have a long line of work on this. So I also learned myself a lot on this literature, and hopefully I can convey some of this message to you. I mean, just to say, of course, that the literature on gender preferences or like gender differences in the labor market is pretty vast. Here we are only going to focus on insights from experimental economics, and in particular, I guess one of the main messages that we want to convey in the chapter is why we think experiments are so great in providing tools that mechanisms that maybe are not so obvious or easy to see with survey or other type of data. So yeah, I'm Lina. Currently, I'm doing a postdoc at NYU Abu Dhabi and the Center for Behavioral Institutional Design. So, all right. So to start, we do know that there is a increase in female labor participation in the labor market, and also increase in educational attainment. However, despite of this improvement in women's outcomes, most of the labor markets worldwide are still characterized by persisting gender gaps. This means that such differences in the labor market cannot be explained by differences in human capital, but there are other explanations behind such a gender gap. Some of the reasons we have seen is that in the first place exists gender sorting into certain sectors and occupations, and this seems to be quite large for different countries, and here I'm citing just for the US context. And at the same time, even within the same occupations, in the career paths of men and women, it seems that it goes very differently. So the question here is, why if women have the same level of education as men, we still continue seeing that women select into sectors and occupations that have low paid salaries, and when they're in the same type of occupations, their careers don't evolve equally as the one that men do. So in this chapter, basically, we cover the literature in experimental economics and try to understand precisely which mechanisms can be behind this type of gender sorting. And in particular, we cover three main areas in the chapter, again, like from experimental economics evidence. So the first one is linked mainly to risk and competition attitudes. So this is long history of research in experimental economics, and I guess previous talk speak a bit about of this on how to relate risk taking behavior and competition to labor market outcomes. Now the second part of the chapter also talks about bargaining behavior and gender differences in bargaining behavior, and how the lab evidence has been so useful to understand some of the mechanisms behind the gender gap. And lastly, the last part of the chapter concludes a bit with the literature on gender discrimination, taking some insights also a bit from beliefs and preferences. So let's start with the first part, which is risk and competition. So as I said, there is a long history of research in risk-taking behavior and competition. And what we do know when it comes to gender differences is that first, compared to men, women are more risk averse. And here we cite again like the recent work of Falch and authors, where they go worldwide to 73 countries and actually observe that this is the case for most of the countries. And at the same time, we also have a vast literature in competition showing that women select themselves less into a competitive environments. There is not such a cross-country study as the one of Fox, but there are several studies in different countries and domains showing this result. Now, the question is, given that there are such strong differences in preferences between men and women when it comes to attitudes toward risk and competition, how important are these gender differences to explain the inequalities in educational outcomes and labor market? So I'm going to start first with educational choices. So what we know from the literature in experimental economics is that competitive students actually tend to choose more demanding tracks in high school. So demanding tracks can be like math-oriented, science-oriented versus humanities. And they're also more likely to go to college or choose higher payer majors at college level. Now, we also, most of this evidence seems also to show that competitives actually predict better educational achievement rather than major choice. And this is one of the main conclusions also within this literature, that competition mainly and risk in some extent explain better education choices at high school level, but not so much at college level. Now, when it comes to the gender gap in education, what we know is that both preferences, attitudes towards risk and competition actually account for around 26% of the gender gap in educational choices, with competition having the most explanation power within this percentage. Also, when it comes to major choice, as I mentioned before, competition or preference for competition does not seem to explain so much the gender gap in major choice. Now, when it comes to labor market, so we also have evidence showing that actually someone that is more competitive tends to have higher earnings in some settings, but this not necessarily explain very well the gender gap in earnings in the first place. Why this is the case? So there is some literature also showing that actually understanding the role of preferences for competition in labor market outcomes and on its own on the gender gap is pretty complex. One of the reasons why this is the case is because overconfidence also seems to have a very strong role on earnings in the first place and on attitudes towards competition. So it's not so clear which part of the competition or preference for competition is due only to this pure taste for competition itself and gender differences on this, or some part of it is also captured to just differences in overconfidence. We also know that there is little impact of risk preferences on the gender gap. Of course, there is a long history of research also showing that risk preferences explain earnings and labor market outcomes, but when it comes to the gender gap, it seems that it's not so strong this effect, but it does predict very well sorting into certain sectors, such as, for instance, self-employment type of decisions that assume high levels of risk. Now, taking together a bit of what I just mentioned about these educational and labor market outcomes, a bit of one of the messages of this literature is that it seems quite important to set theoretical or clear theoretical arguments linking attitudes towards competition, risk, and overconfidence with specific labor markets. And this is something that is sometimes missing in this literature, that is not so clear why in the first place competition should explain earnings or should explain selection into certain type of jobs. And here there are two nice examples of two studies that have shown clear channels between how these preferences can affect specific outcomes. One of them is multiple choice exams, where they showed, for instance, that the gender gap in guessing in exams such as the GRE is due to women being more risk averse and therefore not guessing so much. And the other one is about job search behavior and the relationship with risk aversion and overconfidence. So for instance, risk averse women tend to accept job offers at a much early stage because they're afraid of not getting an offer afterwards. And overconfidence men actually tend to wait longer for accepting an offer because they believe they will get a better offer afterwards. So these are two studies actually showing how clearly these preferences impact different choices of men and women. Now, so this is for risk in competition, moving towards bargaining, the gender differences in negotiation. So there is some evidence showing that actually women negotiate less often than men, and when they do so, they obtain worse outcomes than them. But here is very unclear to understand, or like just with field data to understand what are the mechanisms behind these decisions of women to negotiate less. Partly because there is a high gender selection into occupations, so it can be also the case that women select into occupations where negotiation is not so often. And with field data and survey data, it's really hard to control for all the relevant job and candidate characteristics in the first place. At the same time, experiments offer great control environments where we can recreate like simple negotiation settings where you can not only control for possible selection, but also backlash issues. So laboratory evidence about the gender gap in negotiation has answered mainly two questions, or we group them into questions. The first one is, are men more prone to negotiate that woman or to initiate a negotiation? And the question is yes. However, the effect doesn't seem to be so strong, and it's observed a lot of like substantial heterogeneity in different studies and settings, like in the sense that if there is a strong framing or not a strong framing, if the environment is female stereotypical or not, this seems to change a lot. Now, the second question is whether men obtain better outcomes when they negotiate, and it's often the case, and this is mainly due to two things. First, that men make higher opening offers, and also women receive lower counter offers when they're in the bargaining process. However, here we also have some heterogeneities in studies. For instance, social results does not hold when women negotiate on behalf of others, or when the negotiation environment is framed as a cooperative kind of setting or a female stereotypical domain. What are the drivings of such a gender gap in negotiations? So we identify, or like looking at the literature in negotiation, there are mainly three. The first one is that framing matters. So not having explicit cues about the negotiation possibilities impact very differently men and women. The sense that if it's not explicitly said that there is possibility to negotiate the salary, women are less likely to negotiate than men. The second element present here is gender norms. So women face higher social costs than men when negotiating because it's seen as a assertive behavior that maybe is not very female stereotypical type of behavior. And at the same time, culture might also moderate such an effect. So for instance, this nice study showed that in a matrilineal society, women are even more likely to negotiate than men. Lastly, also we have differences in beliefs. There is some recent evidence that what is the ideal negotiation behavior of the bargainer, in the sense that men and women also have very different beliefs about what you should ideally ask for. And of course, this influences in the first place the negotiator's behavior. All right, now moving towards discrimination. So there is also a long history of research in natural and field experiments, especially also we know a lot about correspondence and audit studies when it comes to gender discrimination. And in particular, the evidence seems to be quite mixed, and that overall there is gender discrimination in many environments, especially when it comes to hiring, job referrals, promotions, and mentoring. Here again, the reasons why we think lab evidence can be very useful to understand the mechanisms behind this is because although these natural and field experiments provide very clean correlations between gender and employer decisions, there is not many insights on the driving mechanisms of why an employer will prefer a man over a woman, or why a woman will select less in certain type of environments. At the same time, lab evidence allows us to isolate either the supply or demand side of the labor market. And of course, this is very important and crucial to precisely identify the impact of discrimination. And lastly, but also preferences and beliefs, as Seda was explaining before, are very important, and we have great tools in experiments to measure, and this is great to understand the behavior of workers and employers. And in experiments, particularly something that is very crucial here that we don't have in other type of setting is that performance is actually observable, and therefore we could actually measure beliefs accuracy and understand whether there is a bias in beliefs in the first place. So the main findings of gender discrimination is that first, there exists statistical discrimination against women in the labor market. This is mainly due to employers holding biased beliefs or miscalibration in beliefs. For recent work, for instance, has shown that beliefs about group differences in performance are one of the primary drivers of discrimination against women. And also, employers tend to overestimate men's performance and update too little, even if they are informed about there are no gender differences in performance. Also, something very interesting about this literature in experimental economics and discrimination is that it seems to be a dynamic process, and this is very much linked to this beliefs channel, in the sense that discrimination against women at earliest stage is present, but it doesn't seem, or it actually seems to reverse in favor of successful female academics at later stage. So if employers hold biased beliefs against performance of women, of course, in a dynamic process where they observe the performance of women over time, this should be eliminated, and this seems to be the case, at least for this setting of academics. At the same time, belief updating can be very different in groups where employers cannot observe individual performance. So, for instance, this is a nice paper on women receiving less credit of co-author work, where it's really impossible to understand how much of the contribution was by one of the co-authors, and female co-authors seems to be, especially junior, penalized by this, whereas men are not. Now, most of the literature on experimental economics and in general in discrimination has focused on the demand side, but it seems to be also very important to understand what is going on in the supply side, especially because beliefs about the existence of discrimination in the first place can affect the gender gap by reducing women's labor supply in the first place, or for instance, also willingness to lead. And this can be very problematic because these beliefs can become self-fulfilling. And for instance, not only for a gender context, but also in general for minorities, discriminatory beliefs influence the minorities' worker labor supply in the first place, or even like training decisions or hiring decisions. And again, here there is evidence showing that even after making employers inform about no gender differences in ability, there is no update in this behavior. So to summarize, I guess, I was not counting much the time, but like what we do in this chapter is first show that women and men tend to work in different occupations and experience very different career trajectories that result in persistent gender gaps in pay. The experimental approach has several advantages. First, it allows us to control for unobservables related, for example, to selection into specific occupational roles. Also, labor market outcomes that result from factors related for either the supply or demand side, and provides the use of incentivized measures of preferences and beliefs to assess actually how different are these factors in explaining the gender gap. So from competition and risk, I don't know, Maria Claire will tell me how much time, if I have time to read this, or I will just leave you with the last.
I think we can perhaps stop very soon because, yeah, we have 1 minute to conclude.
Okay, yes. So just quickly to summarize, so competition and risk, we know that attitudes towards competition are important predictors of high school decisions and income, but not so much of the gender gaps. And in particular, there is need for future research to better understanding the complex relationship between these traits and labor market outcomes. From negotiation, women initiate less often negotiation than men and obtain better, worse outcomes when they do so. There are several factors playing a role here, and this changes depending on the environment. And here there is important caution against pushing women to negotiate, because evidence shows that women know when they shouldn't negotiate in the first place. And lastly, discrimination has shown the important role of biased beliefs and the dynamics effect on updating this behavior. And that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm ready to take questions.
Thanks a lot, Lina, for the great talk. So we have, again, only 1 minute for questions. Perhaps I have one question for you. Why do you think we are always focusing on what we women do not like so much? I mean, competition, negotiation, etc. Why don't we investigate more what we like more than men?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a very good question. And I agree with you that definitely there should be also more on this side on what is exactly that we like better than men. I guess one of the reasons is most of the focus on gender discrimination on gaps focus on male stereotypical domains, right? Like why women don't arrive to the top positions, why women don't select in male-dominated environments. And here is where it comes the question to try to understand which kind of traits drive them out from selecting into this environment. So I think that's one of the main reasons. But I guess also a lot of the literature in gender has started to at least point out that in the sense that the problem is not the woman, it's not that the fact that they have these traits and that's why they don't, I don't know, have higher salaries or arrive to top positions, but are the institutions that are made in this way that are the ones that need to be changed to maybe satisfy better the needs and preferences of women, I guess. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other question for the moment? No. So again, I propose, thank you, Lina. I propose to switch to Astrid's presentation. So from men and women to the household.
Yeah, thank you very much.
In a natural transition. So I want to share your slides.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much. This is a perfect transition. So actually, first, let me thank Marie-Claire for organizing all of that. So I think we should, since I'm the last speaker here, let's give her a round of applause. Women, well done. So what I wanted to, so please stop me when because, well, I'm the last speaker, so probably I have to get kicked out at the end. What I wanted to talk about and what we talk about in this chapter is basically about a field that I'm got really interested over the last 10 years, and that maybe is also less known in experimental economics, but I think is very relevant for experimentalists, but also with respect to labor market decisions, with respect to labor economics, is kind of what happens actually where these decisions are made. Namely, we don't make decisions always alone, we make them together. So this is joint work with Alistair Munro that has been also working on this a lot. And so we tried to propose a new term, actually, kind of how to think about this with this title of behavioral household economics. So actually, I think it was very nice that I was speaking here as the last one, because I think I'm just going to repeat a lot of things that you already said, or kind of trying to follow on this flow in a way, because usually when we think about labor market participation, then we usually have this in mind that we have different people and they have different preferences, right? They have different constraints, they have risk aversion and all of that. And based on that, they make kind of decisions how to get involved in the labor market, or they, due to their abilities and so on, so they get pushed in certain situations in the labor market. And basically what we think this is, what we want to stress with this chapter is that actually we have to be really careful with that, because usually most people are not alone in the world. So they're, fortunately, so most of the time we're not alone, but we're with a family, we're with a partner. So this is a heterosexual couple, sorry for the stereotypes. And usually we make these decisions together. So we talk about it, we discuss it. We also we know that when we propose a certain form of working for ourselves, that this has implications for the others. So we kind of know that these things are all interlinked. Now this obviously also, what I present here is very simplistic. So it's a wife and a husband, then we have other people there, we have children, we have parents, we have larger families, we have all this kind of complexity. And I think in a way what we want to propose is that if we want to talk about labor market participation, we have to think about this somehow. And so if we think about how decisions in households are made, so I've been starting this work with a household economist, and in a way there's a lot of research in household economics, and the problem with that is kind of it's very easy to observe what's coming out of a household, right? We have lots and lots of data from lots of countries where we see what the investment is, what the labor market participation is. However, it's very, very difficult to see how this decision comes about. So we don't see what's happening inside the household. The household, to a large degree, is still very much a black box. So we don't see the bargaining, we don't see the decision making. And so we might say, oh, this is similar to lots of other situations about decision. And so even also the individual, we don't know what's happening. But in a way, families are very interesting, very special. So on the one hand, obviously in a family with those people that are around us, we know each other very well. We also care about each other a lot, usually. So this is important when we talk about social preferences and so on. We, however, still are not a unit. So we also very often have different preferences, different stakes, different interests. So there is also conflict. There are, in addition to alliances. So if we have more than two people, right, there might be different power forces and so on. And so I think from all of that, I think it's just a fascinating field of research where I think we have to study more. So you probably know all this Tolstoy citation that every unhappy family is basically unhappy in its own way. So I think it tells us we have all this heterogeneity that I think we have to study more. So what we want to talk about in this chapter is basically to propose that we should think about basically something that we term behavioral household economics. So bringing into the study of households the behavioral terms that we do in behavioral economics, so basically insights from behavioral economics, insights from experimental economics, but then also because a lot of this research actually has been starting around the world, because once you start talking about this, you quickly notice households and families are not the same in every country. So it's very much linked to also developmental economics and also anthropology. So basically saying, we cannot assume the same mechanisms to work in every country. We also have to look into what's going on basically in different cultures, based on different norms, based on different traditions. And then also link that obviously to psychology, about how we react with respect to others, the impact of these interactions and so on. So we basically want to propose with that that all of that together should help us to understand how decisions are actually made within households with respect obviously to labor market decisions. That's what the motivation for this chapter was, but with respect to lots and lots of other decisions that are made in households. And this obviously has big importance for relevance for policies. Lots of policies are actually aimed at households, right? Very, very often we don't want to influence the individual, but things are very often targeted at households. For example, with respect to labor market participations, we just talked about gender differences. So women are try to encourage to participate more. There are also policies that try to encourage more investment or savings and so on. And what we kind of try to say, we have to understand basically how the household makes these decisions to be able to structure also these policies that they are going to the right person in the household. Okay, so what do we now say in this chapter? So basically we start by saying, when we think about household decisions, specifically with respect to the labor market, there are kind of three things that we have to keep in mind. These are basically how we term them. So the first thing is kind of, what do we bargain about, or what is the decision about? So is the kind of the nature of the returns. Then we have to understand what are actually the differences in the preferences of all the involved parties. So this is actually where we're following up on what we just saw. So obviously in a household, we have lots of different people. They might have different preferences, right? And then the last step is kind of, okay, so we know what we are bargaining about. We have the different preferences, but then all of this has to be aggregated in some way. So there must be some bargaining going on within the household, some kind of decision. And in a way, experimental economics and behavioral economics has been studying all these things already, but what we are trying to do is kind of also bringing them together within households. So let me give you an idea what we're thinking about. So what do I mean when I talk about the nature of returns? So the nature of returns is, for example, with respect to labor market already, what do we earn for income? And income, you might say, okay, so it's just money, but actually income can be given in lots of different ways. So for example, one of the questions is very often, can income easily be hidden, from the partner specifically? And there is lots of evidence, lots of papers that have shown by now that this has very dramatic consequences on the behavior within a household. So if income can be easily hidden, it leads also to more hiding and more to suspicion within households. So just one paper in Senegal, they showed that about 60% of participants were willing to pay something to hide some individual gains from their partner. Another paper, this is actually one that I did with an anthropologist, where we went to a transition economy in the Zimmermann in Bolivia, where we compared how they were reacting in a kind of modified dictator game, where they, on one hand, they were playing for money, and in another situation, they were playing with dried meat, which is also very valuable to them. They became much more suspicious and kind of egoistic and protective of their resources when they were playing with money. Because, you know, money can be also exchanged for something else, so it, basically you have to protect it more if it has to go to the benefit of the family. So this is basically one thing that we wanted to stress. So we have to think really, how do we pay people? What kind of returns does the household receive? The other thing is, of course, money is not the only thing. There are lots of other things that are playing a role when we talk about returns. We have social status. We already talked about these kind of things. We have social pressure. Obviously, and then we have also all these other regarding preferences. So we care about the other. Now, in a couple, this becomes really complicated, because I told you we very much care for the other person in the couple. So we have other regarding preferences also with respect to them. Then we might have other regarding preferences for this other person's income or consumption, but we might also have other regarding preferences for this other person's status. Okay, so as a woman, I might care about my partner's status and do something with respect to that. Just to cite again one example, so you might know about this paper by Bertrand, and showed that there is this significant discontinuity with respect to the share of household income for men versus women at 50%. So that basically right at 50%, you have a real drop in the number of couples where the woman earns more. So there must be something that really, in couples, it's really important also, this distribution. Then we have difference in preferences. So I'm going to go really quickly over that because we've seen that. So obviously the thing is, in most couples, we have men and women. So we have all these different gender, sex differences with respect to risk aversion, with respect to competitiveness, with respect to social preferences. I'm not going to repeat what we've already seen before. But basically, so we have these different preferences, but now we have to think like, how is this going to be aggregated basically in the couple? So what's the aggregation of preferences? So and there has been now more and more experiments that look at that, and it seems that at least it is not a simple function. So a couple doesn't end up automatically at the midpoint between the individual preferences. But it seems to me that it seems more that the household preferences have their own emerging properties. So they are not easily deducible by a simple rule from the individual preferences. And so these household preferences seem to be some kind of combination of, on the one hand, all the individuals' preferences with respect to income, then additional social preferences, so inequality, aversion, and so on, and then some kind of household preferences. So all of these things basically get aggregated together in some ways. So the last point I wanted to mention is then obviously there is some bargaining, some discussion, some process again. This also just got mentioned when we were talking about sex differences in the labor market. So in households, again, it's a very specific case because it's a repeated situation, right? So we know that we'll have an infinitely, well, ideally repeated interaction. It's not rarely anonymous. So we have to take this into account. But we know that there are lots of differences between men and women, how we are bargaining and so. Okay, so what I also wanted to mention is that basically a lot of what we are talking about in this chapter is based on rather recent experiments on households. So there's been a growing literature on this over the last 10 years, 15 years. There's a very, very good overview of that by Munro in the Journal of Economic Surveys, to which I refer here. And basically these kind of experiments try to use the methods from experimental economics. So they incentivize behavior, there's no deception, which basically means in a household context, it's very, very complicated because you have to ensure that things are really anonymous, where people know that they're actually going to meet again. You have to ensure that people cannot talk to each other during the experiments. They have to participate at the same time in some way. You have to ensure that the payment is private, that they, it's not visible to the other if you don't want to study exactly that. So it's basically a kind of a very challenging field to study, but there are lots and lots of studies by now, many of them actually from people in development economics. And just to show you one very nice overview picture. So this is a picture from actually an aggregation from Munro's review chapter, just to show you from lots of different experiments around the world that traced to which degree couples reached efficiency, in different kinds of public good games. You see that there is a large variance. So some couples get very high efficiency, some are much lower. And so this basically shows us already that one of these assumptions of household economics, that's usually that a couple is just maximizing the household income, cannot be really true. So there are lots of other things that are going on. So I really recommend you looking at this review to get some idea. And just to conclude maybe with two citations again. So why are these inefficiencies? So one is basically reasons like distrust or competition. The other thing is actually kind of the opposite. It's like fairness or equality concerns, where couples are willing to forego some kind of efficiency gain. So this is from one of our studies where they have just to allocate some money, where couples go sometimes for an equal allocation, even though this means kind of leaving some money on the table, if in another case where the allocation would have been unequal. Okay, so we are done now. Can I conclude just with what we wanted to propose are these different behavioral dimensions. We also wanted to show that there is a lot of research by now in different areas around the world, but still areas that are largely understudied: China, Russia, and also the United States. There has been a lot of research on basically rural and agricultural areas and much less on urban areas. And as I said, it's a very complex setting. So far people have been focusing on what's going on in couples, but there are lots of other things going on. So there are more people in a family that are interesting to study. So thank you very much. And I guess I'm out of time. So thanks for this session.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Of course, there are many questions we would like to ask you, in particular, for example, whether are you able to predict the durability of couples depending on the closeness of their choices or the complementarity of their preferences? We can talk.
No, I cannot. The short answer is no.
Thank you very much to all of you for participating in this session, for writing the chapters. I must say that I've been really impressed by the quality of the chapters. I'm very proud of this section of the handbook. I think it's really a big achievement of all of you. And thank you again. I propose that we will circulate the link to each other's paper in the chapter, and please continue to interact among us in the future, because I think that there are still many things that we would like to talk about. So again, thank you for your time and for your presentation that were all very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Claire. Thank you.
And
thanks for organizing this.
bye.